Some writers live in fear and dread of their books being turned into films. How did you enjoy Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy?
Well, Tinker Tailor is pretty much the exception. I loved it. If I were going to keep one film version of my work, this would be it. That's partly because it was a masterclass to work with Guinness. And partly, I think, we caught a wave in history, which was very interesting for the audience. And we were particularly helped in Britain because we had a strike in independent television. So the BBC, quite against its expectation, was receiving these huge audiences. So the thing became, Tinker Tailor became at that time a kind of iconic production, and radio was full of whether anybody understood it and that kind of thing. But this came as near, I feel, as near to my imagining as any film has come. When Flaubert, the French writer, was asked whether he wanted Madame Bovary illustrated, he replied in horror, no, because he didn't want to interfere with the imaginative process of the audience, that everybody would have their own Bovary for as long as there were no illustrations. And I think I felt much the same. The genius of Guinness, it seems to me, in both the series, was to leave the character of Smiley intact for the individual imagination. He suggested the possibilities of Smiley as well as the reality. And in that sense, it was an almost mystical performance, I think.
And how did the other characters portray themselves to you? Were they very much as you imagined the other minor characters to be?
Yes, I think I wanted the English social comedy to be encapsulated in that Secret Service organization. And I wanted the gradations of English class to be explicit, the gents and the non-gents, the upstarts and so on, as we awful Brits see people, or used to in those days. All of that was wonderfully reflected, I thought. And once we had Alec, once we had Guinness's yes to the part, then we could empty the National Theatre and the Royal Shakespeare Company. So there wasn't a single lazy piece of casting in the whole production.
I read that Alec Guinness didn't want to accept the role until he'd met you. How did you persuade him to take the part?
Well, Alec was by then quite an old gent, and with an enormous record behind him. He'd never done television before. I think he wanted to make sure that he was in with a sincere production that wasn't going to vulgarize his reputation. I think he reserved himself also in those days, quite simply, the right to work with people he could get on with. He wasn't going to take the kind of dictatorial mayhem that he associated with Hollywood quite often, although he was sufficiently nimble to get round it. So, yes, he wanted to meet me, and he wanted to meet the producer, Jonathan Powell, and he particularly wanted to know that he'd get along with John Irvine. And he was very nervous. He was nervous, and he has this wonderful Eeyore voice that you hear in the... well, I really don't know whether I can do this at all. And one got this in the middle of the night. He'd ring up, "May I speak to Mr. David Cornwall, please?" That's my real name. And I'd say, "Hello, Alec, how did you know it was me?" And I wasn't there. I was there for very little of the shooting. But on the first day of photography, he completely froze. And John Irvine told me that he just, at the end of the day, he said, "I'm absolutely perfectly clear. I'm just absolutely no good for this. Give it to anybody who like. I'll give the money back," and all that stuff. And then the next day, after I think John Irvine had talked to him for a long time, he came into the studio and gave the lens a kiss. And away we went.
Were you able to give him a lot of advice from your own previous experience?
No, I don't think I gave him any advice. I think that I was an orangutan for him. When Alec wanted to watch people and imagine how to communicate their actions and their facial expressions, he'd go to the zoo and watch an orangutan. And an orangutan for him went through all the motions and many of the facial expressions that he wanted to capture. So he pinched a whole lot of things from me. I was conscious he was doing, if I make these kind of gestures, I could see Alec's hairy eyeball tracking me. And then he rang up one day, this was just before we were going to shoot, and I've never met a real spy. Can you possibly put me in touch with that? So I didn't quite know what he meant by this, but I think he wanted a fuss made of him, and he wanted to look at some more zoology. Reassurance. So I rang a man called Sir Maurice Oldfield, who'd been head of the Secret Service, the British Secret Service, and was living, I didn't know it, under a frightful cloud because of his own private behavior and so on. Anyway, he'd been a most distinguished intelligence officer in his time. And we all had lunch together in Chelsea. And when lunch was over, Alec said, "Tell me something." And he seized a water glass. And he held the water glass in his hand, and he said, going round the rim with his finger, "Now," he said, "I've seen people doing that when they're pensive, and I've seen people doing that when they're pensive, but I've never seen people doing that before." He said, "Do you think he's looking for the dregs of poison?" And I think that Alec, like all great artists, was able to keep the child in himself alive. The wonder in him was always open and ready to receive. So that we shot pretty much in sequence. And then the last night, I think it was, the very last night, we were down by the canal. And in the canal house, there is the scene where Alec, with a gun in his hand, is waiting in the dark to see which bad guy steps out from behind the curtain. And then we'll know who the mole is. And my wife and I went and just wished him luck on the last night of shooting down at the canal, and we had everything, cherry pickers. It looked like a great big movie being made. And there was Alec in his underclothes, busy making tactile relationship with the pistol that he was holding, because it's a prop, and he and it had to get to know each other. And he was ruminating, "Now I wonder who it will be. Do you think it'll be? Do you think it'll be?" And then he ran through the cast. "No, I don't think it'll be Roy Bland." "Well, it could be." And then, "Oh dear, well, I hope it isn't that rather nasty Bill Hayden." And it's the controlled schizophrenia of acting. And it's so close to the writing process that it was just completely fascinating. And to wake him from that self-induced coma would have been a great crime. So heaven knows what would have happened. I said, "Alec, for God's sake, you know the script better than everybody else does. You know everybody else's lines. You know who did it." But that would have been saying that Father Christmas didn't exist anymore.
Tinker Tailor, Soldier Spy was very much about deceit and betrayal. What is it about those themes that the viewer, the reader, finds so attractive, do you think?
Well, it was the time of great betrayal. The Cold War was really a game of loyalty, and it was a question always, the question I tried to stretch in the story, between personal and collective loyalty, what you owed to Caesar, what you owed to your country, and what you owed to your own sense of ethics and morality. And the Cold War was fought under a constant mystery. How much can we do in defense of a free and decent society and remain a free and decent society that is worth defending? So there was always a very great unease, particularly in the secret world, about the methods with which we protected our virtues. We saw it. And this put strains on people's loyalty. And very many of the people from those days had experienced the very real rise of communism as an alternative system, social system, in the 30s. It was an issue then put aside, rather, during the 39-45 war, when Russia was our allies. And there were many people who came out of the 39-45 war thinking that peace really could break out in the world, and we would have some kind of universal socialism, which would be at home in Soviet Russia and fan out from there. And so there was great suspicion everywhere. Once the defectors and the spies came to light in our country, the Burgesses and McLeans, in America, for instance, Alger Hiss, if he was a spy, but also their big spies. And then there was McCarthyism and the great witch hunt. And then inside the CIA, there emerged the absolutely extraordinary figure, I think probably the mad figure, of James Jesus Angleton, as he was called, who was the high priest of the belief, the conviction, that every foreign secret service and most foreign governments that were theoretically on our side were penetrated by communist spies. And this vast conspiracy theory, for a while, dominated the Pentagon and the White House and Capitol Hill. And everything was perceived as an intelligence victory. Through the eyes of Angleton was perceived as a tremendously clever piece of chicken feed, a deception. And the real victory was theirs, and we just didn't know it. And this paranoid doctrine was disseminated by the traveling missionaries of the CIA, who were Angleton's people, and by Angleton himself. And part of the effect of that was that secret services hunted among themselves for their own big traitors. And all sorts of defector material came in to the Americans particularly, which encouraged them in this idea. When you've got a preconception, you can always decorate it with slightly bent intelligence. But some of it was true. And in my early days in the secret world, the thing you noticed quite definitely was the atmosphere of mutual suspicion. And as I know now, I didn't know at the time because I was a very junior worm, there was a suspicion that Sir Roger Hollis, who was the head of the security service, our MI5, was a Russian agent. Utter nonsense. That Graham Mitchell, his number 2, who was a world chess champion, was also a Russian agent. He had his turn. One person after another came under the investigative spotlight, in a sense, in the hope that we could toss his head to the Americans and say, now we've found him, are you happy? Can we trade on the intelligence market again? One really has to see intelligence, particularly at this period in history that we're now describing in Tinker Tailor, as a vast, submerged international commerce, where size doesn't matter. You can be a small country like Israel or Britain with a big source, and you'll be at the high table. You've broken a great code. You've got a great human source somewhere. And that's your ticket of entry to power. And there was a huge amount of intelligence trading and a huge amount of assessing the person with whom you were trading, your trading partner, in order to establish whether he or she was fit to receive the intelligence you had so expensively gathered, and what you would gain by giving that person the intelligence. And there was a period when our foreign services and our embassies seemed, for those who were involved, like a vast cover, a shell, for the real Cold War that was going on underneath.
Is that something of the eerie camaraderie you have talked about before between different secret services? This
yes, I
giving and taking of each other's.
They're joined by a lot of things, the spies, very often by their own insufficiency as human beings. People who take refuge in the clandestine world tend to be unanchored or very shy. They want to work in private. They share some sense of specialness so that when they go out and catch a tube, they can say to themselves as they go down the escalator, well, I know a few things you don't. They're a masonry, a fraternity, in the sense they all share the same kind of inside-out thinking that is the nucleus of operational intrigue. They share also, if they're real intelligence officers, they share the perception that there is no end to what they're doing. They make no arrests. They don't want to make arrests. If you're running a secret network here in Hampstead, that's great if I know about it. I can listen to your telephone, I can watch who comes and goes in and out of your house, I can open your mail. So I know what you're doing, I've diagnosed you, and I know the operation. To wrap you all up as if you were criminals, arrest you, I'd simply present myself with a new problem of the same sort. Much better, therefore, always to look for the advantage. That's the big difference between a policeman and an intelligence officer. So the masonry has that in common. They understand that they're involved in expediency. And once you're involved in expediency without any justice the other end, you slip quickly into an anarchic world which you can share. The other thing is, I think, that people who take refuge in secrecy are terrified of having it violated. It may be pretty bad if the Russians find out about it, but it's terrible if the press finds out about it. I don't think many spies expect not to have their names in the files of the opposition, but the idea of having their faces in the newspaper, that's something they wake up and sweat about in the middle of the night, because there somehow their identity and their security are being taken away from them.
One of your characters in Tinker Tailor says, the secret services are the only real expression of a nation's character. Do you believe that's true?
I think that when I was saying that, probably when I said it, I meant subconscious, a nation's subconscious rather than character. It's the 80% of a nation that is below the waterline. And because people gather there, particularly in our society, my British society, and later on in imitation in American society also, people were drawn from a very specific ruling class. That's an incorrect term, but it's perfectly real. In Britain, because of empire, because of the imperial history, because of the necessity of keeping trade routes open over a vast distance, we learned to divide princelings against each other, to inspire Muslim to fight Hindu. We were wicked in terms of colonial manipulation because we had to fight proxy wars. And we did this through the collecting and the distribution of a really fine quantity of intelligence. I mean, the British were up, for better or worse, on the northwest frontier all through the 19th century. They've been there in one form or another ever since. You get your know-how from that. You also form your intelligence service from the elite of your society, from the military elite, from the social elite. It becomes the great game. In the United States, when they were building up their intelligence service with Donovan, first OSS and then CIA, and taking a lot of advice from the Brits, which they wouldn't do anymore, they too started recruiting from Yale and Harvard, and they developed the common room atmosphere of the super spy. People in the image of Alan Dulles and so on. Spies adore their self-image, and they're terrified of having it attacked. And to be sitting with a lot of tweedy, pipe-smoking people back in those days in the Harvard Club or whatever it would have been would give you the feeling, the John Buchan feeling, that we're all terribly polite here, but we do terrible things elsewhere. But quite often the terrible things weren't really done. It was a kind of looking glass war, which is the title of another book I wrote, where people were, first of all, setting up virtual images of themselves and then believing in them.
Graham Greene said that childhood is the bank balance of the writer. To what extent is your interest in espionage based on your particular childhood?
Well, I was practically born as a spy. My mother disappeared when I was 5, defected, as we'd say in the secret world, exfiltrated herself with a lover, and I didn't see her again till I was 21. My father was a crook, was in and out of prison, a con man. I just wrote about him recently in the New Yorker. And his great ambition was that my brother and I should be projected into decent society. We came from working class stock. All my stock, my aunts and uncles spoke with solid regional accents and went to state schools and worked at Sainsbury's across the counter. And that. But for us, nothing was too good, and we were to be gents. We were going to be turned into gentlemen through the private education system. So we did what spies do. We acquired the clothes, we acquired the mannerisms, we acquired the voice. We learned the hostilities and the code of the target that we were penetrating. And we pretended that we came. We didn't do all this with great calculation, but it was the consequence of the way we were launched into society. We pretended that we came from a stable 2-parent family and went to some fine house in the holidays. Whereas we were quite often on the run from creditors and hopping from house to house, or only ever with my father. And so the duplicity was almost instilled in us, and the disproportion between the reality and the pretense was made perfect when we were very young. And then, as luck would have it, I became a linguist and I did enter the secret world. And when I arrived there, I just felt I'd come home. It was that feeling that I could put my inherited larceny at the feet of my country and serve.
I suppose, in a sense, that's why you became a writer, isn't it? Because
yes,
as
beyond
a spy,
that,
you were.
Yeah, I was no good as a spy. I'm just talking about my my comfort level. No, and of course, as children, and then as in the intelligence world, you develop a corrosive eye. You look at things, you remember things, but the mentality of a fantasist is also admitted in the secret world. When you start talking cover, legend, you start building somebody who doesn't exist and equipping them with papers. And if you're dealing with human sources and, as it were, putting them across the border, then that's a creative work. It's an artistic job. And you have to work it out. He had a dysfunctional mother. They broke up. One was in Dresden, the other was in Berlin, and so you're making character even as you recruit and develop agents. And in any operational situation, you're dealing with the possibilities of those characters rather than the reality. And so it is very close to a creative act when it's good, or when it's so fantastic it's completely idiotic. The difference in the intelligence world between very clever and very stupid is often very small. It's the same in writing.
Do you think, talking about the intelligence world, that it's got a bit too sophisticated these days?
I think it's probably become absolutely absurd. We used to have a saying that in the Cold War that the CIA would never use one spy where 12 would do. When they were so overfinanced and overstaffed, through our perception at least, that they were falling over themselves. They were obtaining a piece of information that was then corroborated by other sources, theoretically, but probably all those sources emanated from the same one. I think that happened very much in Vietnam, that they were actually duplicating their own observations and making completely false military assessments. But when you combine the huge boom in electronic intelligence with a corresponding loss of human intelligence, then you reach constipation point, where you're ingesting huge amounts of unrefined intelligence, and you are not properly synthesizing it, you are not selecting who you will give it to, you are not selecting the priority with which you will give it to that person. So many times we read retrospectively that all the information was there when they looked and they never used it. And that's because they have too much. And so the irony is that in our super technological age, we find such a glut of electronic intelligence and so little human intelligence that there's now a rush back to get human sources. Because your individual source, you have, let us say, Saddam's private secretary. He or she will select, evaluate to a point what he or she has heard. You will get information that has already gone through an enormous selection process. Now, to be listening to all his blasted signals, you have no focus. You don't know where you're working. I'm extremely ignorant about the stuff technically, but I'm convinced that there is such a thing as too much knowledge. Or let's say too much information and too little knowledge.
Not enough intuition? Or
I'm not sure it's even intuition. I think it's focus. That to pull out the particular strand that you're looking for from a mass of information requires a very clear sense of priority. And I expect that the ground will now be repaired. But the horror story of 9/11 and the failure of intelligence, I think, does present us with a very real example of what can go wrong when you have too much detail, insufficient intelligent evaluation. I mean, that's just good brain power, good people. Maybe when you proliferate case officers on one target, you run the risk of getting a dispersed vision of something rather than the single story. And that's where a human agent on the spot can actually save you a huge amount of industry and focus your priorities. I remember being told in Israel back in the 70s that to keep a bank of computers that was capable of breaking, as they perceived them, enemy codes, was as expensive as an independent nuclear deterrent. So that gives you some idea of the intensity of labor that's involved in this stuff, as well as the hardware.
Practically all your books have been about the world of espionage. Is there something completely different that you'd like to write?
Well, it's called a genre, writing about this stuff. My definition of a genre is something that limits me, that circumscribes me. I've never found that constraint in writing on this subject, partly because it was the water I swam in for a while, and partly because I can think of no better stage on which to act out the world's comedy. We all of us reach for secrecy and deceit to protect ourselves. We all of us offer one another partial versions of ourselves in order that we coexist at all. We keep our thoughts to ourselves and so on. So all of us, in a sense, are conscious of the secret condition. And that's really how we meet and associate in all sorts of ways, often to spare one another's feelings. And yes, I've never written actually quite a few books that do not touch on espionage. Others that have perhaps stretched the possibilities of espionage in order to accommodate quite other themes. But generally, it's what I do best. It's where I swim most naturally, and I'm completely content with what I've written. Not to admire it, but I don't feel that I've been constrained by the limitations of what is called the genre.
John le Carré, thank you very much.
Thank you.